It is the year 1570. London breathes smoke, spices and ambition. You are standing before the gates of Whitehall Palace, and the smell reaching your nose is a mixture almost impossible to describe to anyone who has never been here. Roasted meat, dried herbs, melted candle wax, and something slightly rotten that you will soon learn to ignore. The city around you pulses with the sound of horseshoes striking stone, the cries of merchants, and the distant ringing of a church bell. But you are no longer simply in London. You are about to enter the heart of England's power, and you have been invited to the Queen's banquet. On paper, this sounds like an extraordinary privilege, a dream. The chance to sit at the table of one of the most powerful women in Europe, taste the rarest and most sophisticated foods in the known world, and witness the grandeur of a court that helped shape Western civilization. But here is the question that will follow you throughout this entire story. What if the banquet that looked like the ultimate expression of luxury was actually an experience that could put your health, your sanity, and perhaps even your life at risk? The answer may surprise you, because it is not what you expect when you walk through those gates. Take a deep breath, because what you are about to discover about Queen Elizabeth's table will completely change the way you think about eating well, living in privilege, and surviving in a world of unimaginable wealth. The first thing you need to understand is that a royal banquet was not simply a meal. It was a political spectacle. Food did not exist only to feed people. It existed to intimidate, to display power, and to communicate to monarchs and ambassadors that England was wealthy, sophisticated, and untouchable. Every dish placed on the table was a diplomatic message disguised as dinner. You enter the Great Hall, and for a moment the sheer scale of it stops you in your tracks. The ceiling is so high that the smoke from the torches disappears before it ever reaches it. The tables stretch out like rivers, covered with white linen cloths that cost more than an ordinary worker might earn in an entire year. Across those cloths, arranged with almost military precision, are objects you recognize, and many you do not. There are silver salt cellars carved like miniature cathedrals, golden goblets, pieces of porcelain brought from China on ships that took months to cross the oceans, and then the dishes begin to arrive. The first sign that something is different comes when you realize there are no forks. This is not an oversight. In England in 1570, the fork was still considered an extravagant and suspicious personal utensil. It was associated with the Italians and regarded by many conservative Englishmen as affected, unnecessary, and even sinful. You will eat with your hands, a knife you brought with you, and a spoon when absolutely necessary. Everyone around you does the same, with a trained elegance that took years to master. You reach for the first dish with your fingers and try not to think about where those hands have been. There is no running water inside the palace. Washing your hands before eating is largely a symbolic gesture, performed with a small basin of scented water carried around by a servant. Its actual hygienic effectiveness is at best questionable. But now we come to what is really on the table, because this is where the story becomes truly fascinating. What Queen Elizabeth I might eat at a state banquet in 1570 was simultaneously one of the most elaborate and potentially dangerous menus a person could imagine. Not dangerous because there was too little, dangerous because there was too much. Not because someone had poisoned the food, but because of a combination of limited scientific knowledge, cultural tradition, and an obsession with sugar that can only be described as collective and devastating. It begins with the meat: mutton, venison, wild boar, goose, duck, pheasant, capon, hare, and something you initially cannot identify on a beautifully decorated platter covered with feathers. You soon discover it is a swan. The swan, a bird protected by law in England today, was considered a delicacy reserved for the nobility in the Elizabethan court. Eating swan was an act of status. Historical descriptions of its flavor called it strong, fatty, and difficult to chew. Not particularly pleasant, perhaps, but absolutely necessary if you wanted the table to look impressive. You try the swan. It is exactly as described: greasy, fibrous, resistant to your teeth. The flavor reminds you of wild duck mixed with something you cannot quite identify. You chew for what feels far too long and finally swallow with effort. Around you, the courtiers do the same, wearing expressions of genuine satisfaction, or at least expressions they have spent years perfecting. You begin wondering whether the problem is the bird or simply the fact that your palate has not yet been calibrated for the 16th century. But as strange as the meat is, it is not the greatest danger on this table. The real danger is sugar. To understand what sugar meant in England in 1570, you have to forget everything you know about it today. Forget cheap industrial sugar sitting on every supermarket shelf. In the 16th century, sugar was a rare and expensive commodity, imported from places including Brazil and Mediterranean islands, transported in heavy blocks that could cost a fortune and were often sold through apothecaries rather than ordinary markets. That's right. Pharmacies. Because sugar was considered medicinal, physicians prescribed it for everything from coughs to digestive problems. It was considered refined, elegant, civilized, and Queen Elizabeth I was famously fond of it. Historical accounts describe the Queen's teeth as severely darkened, likely reflecting the effects of heavy sugar consumption over many years. Foreign visitors who encountered Elizabeth during her reign commented on her appearance, including the condition of her teeth, and inside the palace, sugar flowed in quantities that would seem almost unbelievable today. Almost everything on the table could contain it. Meats were glazed with honey and sugar, sauces were sweetened. Vegetables, when they appeared, could be cooked with sweet ingredients, and then came the desserts. At the Elizabethan court, dessert was not necessarily a neat little course that arrived at the end of the meal. It could become another layer of the feast, a celebration of sugar that continued almost as long as the banquet itself. You look toward the dessert table and see sculptures, not paintings, not marble statues, edible sculptures, castles, animals, human figures, even reproductions of famous monuments, all constructed from elaborate sugar paste by confectioners who were treated almost like artists. These creations were known as subtleties, and they were displayed before being eaten, temporary works of art, designed to delight both the eyes and the mouth. You taste one. It is sweet in an almost aggressive way, a concentrated sweetness without many of the things we use today to balance it. No strong acidity, no contrasting flavors. Just sugar, expertly molded and consumed with pride. And here is the part nobody tells you when they romanticize royal banquets. This table, which looks like the ultimate symbol of luxury and abundance, was quietly damaging the people who lived from it. Think about what is missing. There are no large quantities of fresh fruit because many physicians of the period considered fresh fruit potentially harmful, associating it with illness and digestive problems. Vegetables were also limited for similar reasons. The dominant medical theory was based on the humors of the ancient Greek physician Galen, whose ideas were already more than 1,000 years old by this point. According to this system, foods considered cold and moist could upset the body's balance. Cooking was believed to be essential for making food safer and more nourishing. The practical result was a court diet extraordinarily rich in animal protein, saturated fat, and refined sugar, and extraordinarily poor in the fiber, vitamins, and micronutrients we now know are essential for human health. Gout was so common among the English nobility that it became known as the disease of the rich. It was a strange symbol of status, proof that you ate and drank well enough to develop a painful condition associated with excess. And then there was alcohol. You need to understand the role alcohol played in this world. The water in London in 1570 was often unsafe to drink. The River Thames received enormous amounts of the city's waste, and although people did not understand germs as we do today, they understood from experience that drinking contaminated water could lead to serious illness. The solution was beer, wine, and other fermented drinks. Fermentation was not scientifically understood, but it could make beverages safer than contaminated water. At a royal banquet you will drink wine, a lot of wine. Wines imported from France, Portugal and Spain. Some of them would have been extraordinarily good by the standards of any era, but you might also be served Hippocras, a spiced wine flavored with cinnamon, ginger and, naturally, sugar. It could be served warm, in cups that are refilled with a frequency that soon begins to weigh on you. Refusing a cup offered by your host could be a serious social offense. So you drink. You drink because you are expected to, and because the alternative might be risking the very real dangers of contaminated water and dysentery. 3 hours into the banquet, you have already eaten more food than you might normally consume in several ordinary meals. Your head begins to throb slightly from the wine. The heat from the torches, the bodies, and the fireplaces burning at the ends of the hall creates a suffocating atmosphere. Your elaborate linen clothing, designed to display magnificence rather than provide comfort, only makes it worse. Then you realize there is no bathroom in the modern sense of the word. There are chamber pots hidden in side rooms and private spaces, used with a practicality that would make modern ideas of privacy seem almost unimaginable. And then you look toward the Queen. Elizabeth sits beneath a canopy of red velvet and gold, separated from the other guests by a distance that is both physical and symbolic. She is 37 years old. It is 1570, and she is at the height of her political power. Yet her appearance already reflects the pressures of a life lived under constant scrutiny and treated with the medical practices of an age that could sometimes do more harm than good. Her skin appears unnaturally pale, covered with a cosmetic mixture known as ceruse, made with lead compounds and used to create the aristocratic ideal of whiteness. Over time, lead exposure could cause serious health problems, including neurological damage. She rarely smiles, but when she does, you understand what those foreign observers were talking about. You have now been sitting in that hall for 4 hours, and the banquet still is not over. There is no fixed ending time. The banquet ends when the Queen decides it ends, and while she remains at the table, everyone else remains as well. It is an unwritten rule, but an almost absolute one. Sitting before the Queen sits, leaving before the Queen leaves, eating before the Queen is served. Any mistake in this carefully choreographed social performance could mean public humiliation, the loss of royal favor, or, in more serious cases, consequences far beyond embarrassment. You are trapped with the food, the wine, the heat, the noise, and the crushing weight of social conventions in an age that showed little mercy toward those who did not know how to behave. And here is what nobody romanticizes when they talk about life at court. Most people who inhabited this world were not there simply because they enjoyed it. They were there for survival, for ambition, for fear. A courtier who lost the Queen's favor could lose land, titles, freedom, and everything those things represented. The banquet table was also an arena where alliances were formed and destroyed almost as quickly as the wine glasses were refilled. Every conversation was calculated, every gesture was watched. Every word was weighed before it was spoken. The man sitting beside you, dressed in a dark blue velvet doublet embroidered with silver thread, has spent years trying to secure a position in the royal administration. He comes to every banquet. He eats food he does not like. He drinks more than he should. He smiles at people he secretly despises and who probably despise him in return. All for the remote possibility that someone influential might notice him and mention his name favorably in a royal document. This is not luxury. This is work. Exhausting, physically uncomfortable, psychologically brutal work. The woman 3 places to your left wears a corset so tight that she breathes in small, controlled portions. She smiles. She laughs at exactly the right moments. And she barely eats, because trying to eat elegantly inside a corset like that is a technical challenge that requires years of practice and a willingness to endure suffering that you simply do not possess. And the servants? You need to look at the servants. Dozens of them move through the hall with almost invisible efficiency, bringing dishes, removing others, refilling cups, and adjusting torches. These men and women woke before dawn, while London was still dark and cold, to begin preparing a banquet that would consume their entire day. They carry heavy loads, they endure the heat, they receive orders in tones that do not invite an answer. And when everything is finally over, they will receive only a tiny fraction of what was spent on the sugar used to build those edible sculptures that lasted less than an hour before being destroyed with silver spoons. The contrast is so absolute, so visceral, that it sits heavily in your stomach, much like the swan you're still trying to digest. And now comes the question this entire story has been building toward. Would you actually survive the Queen's banquet? Technically, yes. You would probably walk out alive. You might leave with a spectacular hangover, unforgettable indigestion, and perhaps a headache that could last for days. But would you survive the lifestyle that this banquet represented? That is the real question, and the answer is much darker. If you lived like the English nobility of 1570, eating like them, drinking like them, using their cosmetics, and being treated by the physicians they trusted, your health could be exposed to dangers that were invisible to them. Meanwhile, a peasant eating dark bread, vegetables from the garden, and weak homemade ale might unknowingly have a more balanced diet. The peasant moved more, ate more simply, and was less exposed to the dangerous cosmetics and medical treatments available to the wealthy. In this world, privilege could literally be poisonous. Queen Elizabeth I would die 33 years after this banquet in 1603 at the age of 70. That was a remarkable lifespan for her era, and even more remarkable considering the decades of exposure to lead-based cosmetics, an unbalanced diet, and medical treatments that included purging, bloodletting, and substances we would recognize today as dangerous. She survived despite her doctors, not necessarily because of them. She survived with a physical constitution and determination that were genuinely extraordinary. But what remains with you when you finally rise from that table and step into the cold London night is not simply admiration for the splendor. It is something more complicated, something more honest. That table was not what it appeared to be. Luxury was not luxury in the way we understand it today. It was performance. It was politics. It was an elaborate and enormously expensive language people used to communicate power in a world where showing weakness could be fatal. And the people who lived in that world were extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily limited at the same time. They were brilliant in politics, art, navigation, architecture, and poetry. But they were limited by an understanding of the human body, nutrition, and medicine that would take centuries to approach what we now consider basic knowledge. They were doing the best they could with what they knew, and what they knew was, in many cases, slowly killing them while they celebrated. What you carry away from that table, from that night, from that palace filled with smoke, music, ambition, and sugar, is a lesson about the difference between appearance and reality, between what an age believes to be true and what is actually true, between what appears to protect us and what truly does. Every generation feels that it has finally discovered the correct version of the world, that previous beliefs were naive, that the mistakes of the past have been overcome, that the table being set right now is the right table, and perhaps some of that is true. But the story of Elizabeth I's court reminds us, with a lesson she herself probably would not have recognized, that the certainty of one generation rarely survives completely intact under the judgment of the next. You walk back through the gates of Whitehall. London continues around you, noisy, foul-smelling, chaotic, and magnificently alive. And you realize something. The greatest luxury of all, the only one that truly matters in any age, is knowing the difference between what is actually good for you and what merely looks that way. So now I want to ask you, if you had received an invitation in 1570, would you have accepted the Queen's banquet? Would you have risked the food, the wine, the pressure, and the hidden dangers just to experience the greatest display of royal luxury England had to offer. Tell me in the comments, and if this story changed the way you think about what it really meant to live like royalty, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because the past often looks beautiful from a distance. But when you sit down at its table, you may discover that the things you thought were symbols of luxury were actually the things slowly destroying you.